It is 4 o'clock. I will call the meeting to order. 1 second. I'm getting feedback.
We need to turn
How's that?
it.
Okay. All right. We're good to go. We'll start with the roll call, please.
Mayor Sue Patterson,
Present?
Deputy Mayor Warren Dicker,
Present.
Councillor Harold Leet,
Present.
Councillor Dave Hawking,
Present.
Councillor Carol Hudson,
Present.
Councillor Brandon Cable. Does not appear to be online yet. Councillor Susan Zackle.
Present.
I'll begin with the land acknowledgement. As we work toward reconciliation with Indigenous people, we begin our meeting today by respectfully acknowledging that we are situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, the people of Three Fires known as Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. And further give thanks to the Chippewas of Saugeen and the Chippewas of Nawash, now known as the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as the traditional keepers of this land. So welcome to our Finance Committee meeting for Monday, February 24th, 2025. Good afternoon, council, staff, guests, the viewing public, and the media. Council, does anyone have a disclosure of pecuniary interest or a conflict of interest? As always, if one should arise during the meeting, you may declare it then. Item 4, we do not have any additions or deletions to the agenda. So we'll move on to our delegations. Item 5, and we have Watson and Associates with us today. Welcome, Sude. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here quickly. Sorry, I think the wrong screen. Give me 1 second.
I'm wondering.
Are you able to see the presentation all right?
Yes. And Sude, I'll ask if you can just speak a little louder.
Of course. Okay, good afternoon, members of council, and through you, your worship. My name is Sude Jain, and I'm here on behalf of Watson and Associates to facilitate this workshop, which really represents a key milestone in the development of the town's 2025 asset management plan that is due to be finalized over the coming week. The purpose of this workshop is twofold. First, this workshop provides an opportunity to present council with the outputs of the modeling work that has been completed to date to support the asset management plan. And second, the workshop provides an opportunity to have an open discussion with council regarding the levels of service council proposes its municipal infrastructure assets to provide over the long term. Now, understanding that this is a fairly long presentation, I would like to provide council with ample opportunity to ask any questions and provide feedback. As such, if it's okay with you, your worship, I would suggest we incorporate a brief pause for questions prior to the presentation of the levels of service options for water and wastewater, so at slide 10, and then again, prior to the presentation of the levels of service options for tax-funded assets. So that would be at slide 18, if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
Okay, perfect. So starting off with a bit of regulatory context that hopefully illuminates why asset management planning has become such a frequent topic of discussion for municipalities in Ontario. Asset management planning really came to the forefront of municipal politics with the ascension of Ontario Regulation 588-17 in 2018. The regulation, which now governs asset management planning for municipalities in Ontario, sets out a series of requirements pertaining to municipal asset management plans that must be met in a phased manner, as illustrated in the Gantt chart on this slide. The first step to compliance was the development of a strategic asset management policy, which is a fairly high-level statement of commitment to asset management planning and lays out the guiding principles that would be adhered to throughout the town's asset management planning journey. The town completed this requirement back in 2015, so well ahead of the regulatory deadline. Now, it is important to highlight that OREG 58817 does require municipalities to review their asset management policies on an every 5-year basis, which is represented by the green marker that you see in the Gantt chart. There is, however, no requirement to amend the policy, but it should be reviewed to ensure that it is relevant with respect to the town's ever-evolving asset management planning environment. Next, municipalities were required to prepare asset management plans for their core infrastructure assets by July 1st of 2022, and for their non-core infrastructure assets 2 years later by July 1st of 2024. Core infrastructure assets are specifically defined in the OREG as being roads, bridges, and structures, and any asset that is utilized in the provision of water, wastewater, and stormwater services. And then every other asset that it is under care and control of the municipality is defined as a non-core asset. And these asset management plans require municipalities to include just some summary level information regarding their assets. So things such as replacement costs, average ages, any available information on the condition of assets. These plans also required municipalities to define their levels of service framework for each asset category, along with some quantification of how well assets are performing with respect to those levels of service. So really those first set of asset management plans could be viewed as intermediary plans, sort of as stepping stones that are leading us into the final set of requirements of the regulation, which are due by July 1st of this year. And these final set of requirements involve the development of a comprehensive asset management plan that combines all asset categories and builds upon the previous plans by including 2 major new components. The first component is the determination of the levels of service that municipality is proposing its assets to provide over the next 10 years. And the second is a financial strategy to achieve those proposed levels of service that identifies how capital investment requirements will be funded. Now, it is important to highlight that this final asset management plan supersedes the previous plans, and as such, the town will be in full compliance of OREG 58817 following the completion of its 2025 asset management plan. And similar to the requirement for the AM policy, the AMP is also required to be reviewed on an every 5-year basis. But what is different is that the OREG uses shall language, which requires the plan to also be updated on an every 5-year basis. Whereas the policy is only required to be reviewed, the plan is required to be both reviewed and updated on an every 5-year basis. So for municipalities, asset management plans are not just important because they identify a systematic approach to managing assets at the lowest overall cost, but also because upper levels of government have now tied major sources of sustainable external funding to the completion of asset management plans. So you'll see here are 3 main sources of sustainable external funding that are available to municipalities currently, starting with the Canada Community Building Fund, which is formerly the gas tax, the federal gas tax, requires recipients to develop and implement an asset management plan to maintain eligibility. The Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund, commonly known as OCIF, requires that annual funding allocations can only be applied towards capital expenditures on core infrastructure assets that are part of an asset management plan. And finally, the Development Charges Act requires background studies to include an asset management plan that covers the assets whose capital costs are proposed to be recovered through DCs. The town is currently undertaking an update of its development charges background study in conjunction with the asset management plan. And Watson is also assisting with the town with the development of that DC background study. And our AMP team has been working in close collaboration with the team developing the background study to ensure that, that there's no misinformation between the teams. The slide here illustrates at a high level the process that we have been undertaking to deliver the town's 2025 asset management plan. As you will notice, this workshop represents a key milestone as we approach the final stages of, in the development of the AMP. Prior to this workshop, a fair bit of work has been completed both by the town's project team as well as our team, as represented by the parallel work streams on this slide. The first parallel work stream, which is represented by the orange dotted line, involved the identification of some proposed levels of service options for council's consideration, along with the accompanying lifecycle activities that would need to be performed on assets to achieve those levels of service. And I'll dive deeper into those levels of service and lifecycle management a little bit further on into this presentation. So that first parallel work stream resulted in the development of 10-year capital expenditure forecasts for each of the level of service options being considered. The second parallel work stream, which is represented by the green dotted line in this slide, involved the analysis of the town's financials and resulted in the development of a financial strategy model. And then the 10-year capital expenditure forecast generated through the first work stream were then merged with the financial strategy model to enable us to assess the financial impacts associated with each level of service option. We have refined the financial strategy model through some calibration that has already taken place in collaboration with the town's project team. However, we want to bring council into the process at this stage to both present the financial impact associated with those options, as well as seek input into the level of service targets. And the level of service targets in the financial model will now undergo a further revision based on the input and direction given by council today, with the objective being that the final asset management plan report is fully reflective of council's intent with respect to the outputs it expects its assets to deliver over the long term. Jumping into some of the analysis related to assets. This slide illustrates the current replacement value of the town's infrastructure assets, which sits at close to $500 million currently in 2025 dollars. There's a variety of asset categories that are included within the scope of this asset management plan as presented on this slide. Water and wastewater assets together represent the largest share of total replacement costs at approximately $171 million, or 38% of the overall share. This category comprises close to 55 kilometers of water mains, 45 kilometers of wastewater mains, and water and wastewater facilities. The second largest share of total replacement costs belongs to tax-funded facilities at approximately 141 million, or 31% of the overall share. There are 12 facilities that are included within the inventory, including the P&H Center, the municipal office, the various public works buildings at the yard, at the EMS station, and some other buildings as well. The note here, just to provide a caveat, is that the valuation of the fire hall is based on its 2024 construction cost inflated to 2025 dollars, and the valuation of the police services building is estimated based on future construction costs. So very much preliminary estimates for the valuation of those two, or for the police services building. Transportation assets, which comprise approximately 45 or close to 45 kilometers of roadways, 33 kilometers of sidewalks, and over 900 streetlights, represent the third largest share of total replacement cost at approximately $74 million, or 16%. And over 60 million of that is for roadways alone. And the remainder of the town's assets represent approximately $64 million of total replacement cost, or 15% of the overall share. When looking at what this means for a typical house in the town assessed at $220,000, we see that such a property would own approximately $114,000 of municipal infrastructure in current replacement value. And it's sometimes interesting to view replacement value of assets in this manner allocated to a typical house, because it really highlights the need for a systematic approach to be implemented in the management of assets so that their worth to each household does not decrease over time. So how do we establish this systematic approach? The first step in establishing this approach is the determination of the levels of service, or the outputs, more generally speaking, that assets are required to deliver over the long term. This process involves the development of a level of service framework that consists of the three elements described on this slide. Excuse me. The first component is a service attribute, which describes the aspects of a service or characteristics of a service that are important to the town and to end users. The second component is the level of service statement, which the OREG refers to as the community level of service. And it describes the town's intent in plain language and provides some additional information on the aspects of the service the town believes are important to end users. And the final component is the technical levels of service that quantifies how performance with respect to the service attribute and the level of service statement will be measured. So in effect, the technical level of service really is a direct linkage between the service that's being delivered and the assets that are providing it. In a way, the technical levels of service can be viewed as a representation of how assets are performing in the delivery of municipal services. So to give an example here, we might say that the quality of the town's roadways is an important attribute to end users. To further describe this attribute of quality in plain language, we might say that it's important for the town to strive to provide a comfortable ride quality to all its users. Now, how do we put this in terms that can be quantified? Well, we might say that the pavement condition index rating of roadways is an important technical representation of their overall quality as experienced by end users. Now, the difference with this asset management plan compared to the previous ones is that the previous ones only required municipalities to identify the current performance with respect to those technical levels of service. Now we're actually required to set targets. And so in this example, the target is to maintain the road network condition above an average PCI score of 80, which would mean that, that roads are maintained in an adequate quality. Now, once those levels of service targets are set, we now need to consider the various different life cycle activities that need to be performed on assets over their full life cycle to achieve those targets. So to build upon the previous example, to maintain the road network condition above an average PCI rating of 80, we need to identify the various interventions that need to be performed on individual road segments so that the average condition for the network as a whole is maintained above the specified target of an 80 PCI. And this would involve the identification of the various mid-life cycle activities that need to be performed on road segments, such as microsurfacing, for example, or resurfacing, along with the life cycle year in which they're performed, as well as their respective costs. So through this process, which is referred to as the full life cycle cost assessment, we're able to identify the capital investment requirements of assets to deliver the proposed levels of service. So now let's sort of tie this all conceptual stuff together with an example. So this slide here represents the full life cycle of a road segment. And in this particular example, this road segment is 1 kilometer in centerline length. Starting with the table on the right-hand side, we see that the various life cycle activities that are required to be performed on this road segment listed along with the life cycle year in which they are to be performed and their respective costs. So in this example, this road segment undergoes 3 rounds of resurfacing every 20 years prior to a full depth reconstruction that occurs at the 80-year mark. Summing the cost of these activities, we find that the full life cycle cost of this 1 kilometer road segment is approximately $3.2 million over an 80-year service life. This means that the amount of money that the road segment requires on an annual basis to fully fund all these life cycle activities is approximately $40,000, which is referred to as this road segment's annual funding target. The top chart on the left-hand side of this slide shows the condition of this road segment, or how the condition of this road segment, rather, is expected to degrade over time. If no life cycle activities are performed on this asset, it would reach a PCI rating of 0 by year 60, which is represented by the red dashed line. By performing the various mid-life cycle activities that are identified in this chart, we see that we're not only able to extend the life cycle of this road segment, but also maintain the road segment in a higher overall condition throughout its entire life cycle. Now, the bottom chart is a really interesting chart on the left-hand side. So that chart shows the financial impact associated with this life cycle management strategy. The blue bars in the chart represent the cost associated with each of the life cycle activities identified in the table on the right. The green dashed line represents the annual funding target of $40,000. And represented in the green mountain in the background is the expected reserve balance. Now, this reserve balance is built on a few assumptions. The first one being that every year a contribution into the reserve of $40,000, so up to that annual funding target amount, is made, and that all life cycle activities are funded through this reserve. So we're fully implementing a capital funded from reserve strategy. Now, you will notice that this balance, this reserve balance, building over time in the years between life cycle activities, and then depleting as life cycle activities are performed. What's really interesting is when you look at the reserve balance at the end of the asset's life cycle at year 80, so at this mark here. And what you'll notice is that the reserve balance in that year sits at $0, meaning that all of the reserve funds that were collected throughout the 80 years are fully utilized to fund the capital expenditures associated with this road segment at the end of its life cycle. As such, that annual funding target represents the average funding required annually to fully fund all the life cycle activities associated with a particular asset, in this case, 1 kilometer of a road segment. The black line on this chart represents the 10-year moving average of the asset's life cycle cost. So in each year, the value of the black line represents the annual average of the expenditures expected to occur over the next 10 years. It's interesting when you review this line and how this line really starts moving throughout this asset's life cycle, particularly in the periods between when life cycle activities are required to occur. What you'll notice is that there are several instances where the line sits at a value of 0. In those instances, if we sort of restrict our asset management planning cycle to just the following 10 years or 10-year forecast horizon, we might arrive at the conclusion that this asset actually requires no funding over that period. Now, in reality, however, when you look at it over its full life cycle, significant capital expenditures are required for that asset beyond that particular 10-year horizon, which need to be saved for, which further illustrates the importance of assessing the full life cycle of assets. And then lastly, to tie a bow on this, there are periods when between when life cycle activities are performed that the reserve balance builds quite significantly. However, again, it's important to realize that that balance in the reserve is being fully utilized once the asset reaches the end of its life cycle, so at that 80-year mark. And therefore, if the funding being provided to assets annually is assessed through a full life cycle cost assessment, the increases in reserves should not raise red flags that those funds will eventually be fully utilized. And that particularly is relevant for long-lived assets. So particularly in the case of underground water and wastewater and stormwater infrastructure, in the case of some roads as well, some facility components are long-lived. So you would want reserve funds to build up so that you're decreasing future reliance on debt, as well as mitigating the impact of any capital expenditures on the levy, right? So you're ensuring that the tax levy is not reacting to the peaks and valleys that capital expenditures are characteristic of. So now the analysis that was shown in the previous slide for just a single road segment needs to be performed for every asset that is under care and control of the town. So that's close to $500 million worth of assets. That analysis is carried forward for every single asset. And what you'll see on this slide are the various different elements that help us develop the financial strategy model for the town after we have done the analysis considering the full life cycle of all assets. So particularly, and what I do want to highlight here is the operating budget forecast. So of course, to be able to identify the tax levy impacts on the water and wastewater rate revenue impact, the operating budget forecast needs to be included in the financial model. However, because with respect to this asset management plan, we really are trying to, or what's within scope is resolving the capital side of the town. Those operating dollars are really only subject to minor increases year over year based on estimates of future inflation. So they're only subject to sort of nominal increases year over year. And what is excluded from that operating budget forecast is any additional expenditures that would be required to sustain program changes or would be required to fund existing deficiencies that currently exist within your current base budget. And I'll describe this later through some of the charts in the following slides. But at this point, I think it's important to highlight that although that operating budget forecast is included for completeness, it's only subject to sort of nominal year-over-year increases based on estimated future inflation. However, the capital side of the town is fully resolved. So we have fully assessed the life cycle funding targets. We've fully assessed the life cycle expenditure forecast. We've considered all the various external funded sources of funding for capital expenditures, as well as assessed the impact on reserve and reserve funds, as well as debt requirements. So with that, I'll pause here and give council an opportunity to ask any questions or provide any feedback if needed.
Okay, thank you. Council, any comments or questions at this time? Deputy Mayor Dickert.
Excuse me. Thank you, Worship, and thank you, Steve, for the presentation thus far. You mentioned 114,000 per house was the asset value for average $220,000 assessed house, I guess. How does that compare with, I'm assuming those are actual numbers for Hanover. How does that compare with other communities?
It's very much in line. So what we notice as we've been conducting this analysis for various municipalities is that average for most municipalities sits in that $100,000 on the low end to perhaps around 150, 160, 170 on the high end. So you're very much in the range, perhaps a little bit on the lower end of the range, but I certainly have seen plenty of municipalities that have a lower value per household than Hanover. So well within that range, well within the expected range.
And my second question is more maybe at Ron or Sherry. Do we have kind of a target right now, rebuilding 1 kilometer of roadway per year? Is that kind of an average? And if we have 40 kilometers of road, are we actually exceeding what we need to do if it's an 80-year total rebuild cycle?
Well, we wouldn't do a kilometer a year now. I'd say we're under half a kilometer,
So half a
somewhere
kilometer would be
around
just about right on then.
300-400 meters a year. When you pick on one major reconstruction project, that's kind of the length of what it would be. Block to block we use in that range.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Fleet.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for your report. And I don't know how to really word this, but we're putting funds in reserve, but yet we're trying to keep our taxes affordable for our residents. And I don't know how, if we keep taxes lower, how we can put more money into reserve to do these projects. And it's sort of a tough balance. So, so if we go low in taxes, we're maybe not putting as much away in reserve. So I don't know if you understand my question or where I'm coming from, but I'm just trying to understand that.
Yeah, and through Your Worship, I think that's an excellent point, and I think you've pretty well highlighted the issue underscored the challenge that I think a lot of municipalities in Ontario are currently facing, which is this balancing of affordability versus the level of service that you're expecting your assets to deliver. And so leaving the reserve piece aside for 1 second, I would say that the largest influence on tax levy or water and wastewater rate increases are the levels of service options. And so we'll go through some of those levels of service options as part of the discussion today, but certainly I would, there's no restriction to limit our level of service options to just what's being presented as part of this slide. So we're well within our scope to consider other level of service options that council may want to implement over the long term for its assets to deliver. But really, that's how we balance the potential tax levy and water and wastewater rate revenue increases is through looking at levels of service. And if those increases are unaffordable, then reassessing or revising the levels of service that we expect our assets to provide, and hopefully that calibration process results in tax levy and water and wastewater rate revenue increases that are more palatable. Now, with respect to the reserve piece, I again think it's important to highlight that if the annual funding target is well informed through a really comprehensive assessment of the various life cycle activities that need to be undertaken, and the cost, the unit costs that inform that analysis are also up to date. And that annual funding target, it really is an accurate representation of how much you should be saving in reserves, so that your future levy increases don't have to be reactive to in-year capital expenditure requirements, right? So you're saving money in reserve, you're trying to fully implement a capital funded through reserve strategy. And what that allows you to do is, or any municipality to do, is smooth out tax levy increases over the long term. So that, again, your levy is not fluctuating or spiking in 1 year into the next, because you have a large sum of capital expenditure requirements that can't be funded through reserve. So it really is now looking at the full life cycle cost of an asset, understanding that those reserve funds will be fully utilized in the future. So hopefully that answers the question, but happy to provide further clarification if needed.
Yeah, thank you. Just, trying to find that balance, I guess that's what we have to do. Thanks.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Hudson.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you for all of this great information. Just a couple of things. I'm just wondering, because we have used the valuation of the fire hall as the new construction cost, as well as the upcoming police building, will the new water tower, is it taken into consideration for the new valuation as well, or the existing?
It's the new valuation, so it's and through your worship, I apologize for that. It is certainly the current replacement cost valuation that was presented as part of the 2025 budget for the town.
And then my other question, just for my information, the 12 facilities are what?
Unfortunately, I don't have a listing of facilities, but I can certainly get back to you on that with that information following this workshop.
We could probably brainstorm those 12.
Yeah.
Chris?
Civic Center, Medical Clinic, 147th Avenue, the water plant, the wastewater plant, the pumping stations, Public Works. What else do we have? The fire hall, the police station. I said P&H Center, I thought. And I don't know if we separated out Civic Center and theater and community hall. I thought that should be one, I'm pretty sure. And I think there was the Binkley Patterson Pavilion and another, the park pavilion down at the town parks. Correct. How many are we up to?
Six, 7, 8, 9, 10.
We got 11 so far. We could. The paramedical is 147th Street, so it'll be the same.
There's also the salt shed, which was a separate line item in the inventory.
Oh, okay, so the salt and sand shed
Oh,
that's at the same location as the Public Works. So there's your 12.
And happy
Anything
to
else? Counselor Hudson? No? Okay. We're good? All right, Sudhay, you're good to continue, please.
perfect. So jumping into the proposed levels of service options for water and wastewater, and starting off with a not so fun one, because there aren't really a lot of level of service options to consider for water and wastewater assets. When we think about the level of service framework for the town's water and wastewater assets, this slide it represents the level of service framework. And the last column on this chart outlines the relevant impacts to the life cycle management of water assets with respect to the service attributes and the level of service statement that are represented in the first two columns. Now, for both water and wastewater assets, it is recommended that alternative levels of service not be considered. And the main reasoning behind this recommendation is due to the way in which water and wastewater services are legislated, which by and large dictates how the overall management of these assets. The water and wastewater assets, as I'm sure you're well aware, are governed by pretty strict pieces of legislation, and as such, setting alternative levels of service may lead to non-compliance issues. Now, that being said, we do want to ensure that water and wastewater assets are performing adequately with minimal service interruptions due to asset failures. And this is ensured through the timely completion of rehabilitation and replacement activities related to these assets, as well as through regular reviews of asset conditions to proactively identify poor performing assets. Now, one item that I think is important to highlight here, which might be something you're wondering at this very moment, is the effects of growth. The level of service target is to maintain the current coverage of both the water and wastewater systems with respect to the percentage of properties that are connected to either system. Now, of course, as growth occurs, new infrastructure may need to be in place to maintain the coverage at current levels. However, it's expected that those growth associated costs would be identified in the development charges background study, and their initial construction costs would be funded through the development charges collected. Now, funding the initial construction cost is one thing, but there's also that annual funding target piece. So what we have done as part of this, this financial model is we've assumed that any growth-related expenditures are fully funded from development charges. So that's particularly relevant in the case of wastewater, where there is a planned wastewater control plant expansion. So that initial construction cost would be expected to be fully funded through development charges, at least with respect to the stage that we are at currently. Of course, that assumption would be further evaluated through the development charges background study that is also currently being completed. However, what we have done in the model is include the increase to the annual funding target that generated by that wastewater control plant expansion. The other item that's important to highlight here is that although the technical level of service are not provided in this table, there are various technical levels of service that inform the lifecycle management impacts that are shown in the table. So really the intent of this table is to distill all that information down into relevant points for council's consideration. So really the key decision-making points as represented by the bullets on the in the third column on this table. I'm going to skip over wastewater because it's largely the same level of service considerations as water assets. And we can jump into the capital expenditure forecast. What you'll see on this slide is the capital expenditure forecast for both water and wastewater assets in uninflated 2025 dollars. So represented in the base of the bars that you see there in blue are the various different asset renewals and replacements that need to occur for water and wastewater assets. And those capital expenditures have been forecasted based on the age profiles of all water and wastewater assets, and then further supplemented with the town's current 5-year capital expenditure forecast. What you see there in the green dashed line is the annual funding target. It's really interesting what happens post 2029 when the wastewater treatment plant upgrades come online, is this funding target start to increase and actually increases by about $1 million once that wastewater treatment plant has been expanded, or that expansion has been constructed. That annual funding target prior to the expansion was sitting at approximately $2.7 million and pretty evenly split between water and wastewater. And then following the expansion in 2030, that annual funding target jumps up by about $1 million to $3.7 million. And of course, a larger share of that now is represented by wastewater. And that annual funding target, similar to that example for the road segment, is based on the life cycle management strategies that consider the full life cycle of every single asset. Now, so far we've been talking about the cost side of the equation. So now let's bring in the other side, the funding side of the equation. And so what you'll see here represented in this white dot is the current capital funding capacity for the town. So how much money is available in your 2025 water and wastewater budget to go toward the funding of capital expenditures or funding of capital assets in general. And what we see when we do that analysis is that the funding target and the capital funding capacity is actually very, very closely aligned with each other. So water and wastewater assets currently are well funded and really represents a strategic investment by council and through staff to maintain these assets in really good condition over the years. But funding target and the capital funding capacity is very, very closely aligned with each other. And in fact, the current capital funding capacity slightly exceeds the annual funding, or is right at the annual funding target, excuse me. That capital funding capacity includes two items. The first, of course, is the contribution to capital reserves that are happening. And then in the 2025 budget, there was also some capital expenditures that were directly funded through water and wastewater rates to the tune of about $2 million. So those two together comprise the capital funding capacity. And of course, as mentioned earlier, those contributions to reserves are really key in building up reserve funds to fund the significant costs associated with the eventual replacement of underground water and wastewater lines, which really are heavy capital investments that eventually need to be made. And the more money that you have in capital reserves to fund those costs eventually reduces future reliance on external debt. Now, excuse me. So far, everything was in current 2025 dollars. Now, this slide shows what the financial forecast looks like when we inflate everything. So we've applied capital inflation to all the capital expenditures as well as the annual funding target. And what you see here is that the annual funding target is gradually increasing. So really it's by implementing that capital funded through reserve strategy that allows these increases to be largely uniform and to smooth out these increases over the long term. And what you'll see at the end is that the capital funding capacity aligns exactly with the annual funding target. So you're currently at the at a no funding gap, and that is expected to be maintained throughout the 10-year forecast. So now when we combine this all together into the overall financial forecast, and this is a fun chart to go through, which you'll notice in the bars is the various different expenditures that are occurring for the water and wastewater budget. So represented in the darker base of the bars are the net operating expenditures. And what you'll see is those net operating expenditures rising gradually year over year. So as I mentioned before, really is outside the scope of the asset management plan to assess what the growth in, or really deep dive and formally assess what the growth in net operating expenditures is expected to be over the next 10 years. So those base operating expenditures in 2025 are subject to nominal increases based on estimated future inflation year over year. Layered on top of that in the lighter section of the bars are the capital expenditures that are happening year over year. So all the various different asset renewals and replacements, again, characterized by peaks and valleys. And then on the other side of the equation, so now moving from the capital expenditure side to the capital funding side, that is represented by the line that you see there in black. And really for water and wastewater assets, the source of capital funding are the rate revenues. And of course, those rate revenues and any excess rate revenues get contributed to reserves and eventually get utilized to fund future capital expenditures. But really the main source, the initial source of funding for anything water and wastewater related are the rate revenues. So that's what you see in the black line there with markers, again, gradually increasing year over year. And those gradual increases are estimated to amount to approximately 5.41% year over year. And what you noticed previously is that the current capital funding capacity aligns very closely with the annual funding target for water and wastewater assets. And so there is no funding gap, infrastructure funding gap that needs to be eliminated through the increases in rate revenues. So these increases in rate revenues are only necessary to keep pace with the estimated inflation in capital and net operating expenditures. Then what you'll see in the background of this chart represented by the green mountain is the year-end balance in capital reserves. It's interesting to notice what happens to that balance. So in any year where where the rate revenue is less than the top of the bar, so meaning that the money coming in is less than the money going out, reserves are utilized to fund the excess. So what you see in year one is, or year one perhaps isn't a good example, but moving into year two, what you see is that the rate revenues are not up to a level that's sufficient to fund all the net operating expenditures as well as the capital expenditures. And so that excess gets funded through reserves, and you see the reserve balance start declining in year two. Now that's in direct opposition to what happens in year three, so in 2027, where the rate revenues actually exceed how much the level of expenditures that are required. And so in those years, you see the year-end balance and capital reserves start rising. And in fact, it rises to approximately $37 million at the end of this 10-year forecast, which again might raise some red flags, but understanding that this is that the contributions being made into the reserve are well informed through the annual funding targets that we've set for water and wastewater assets, these reserve funds will be fully utilized in the future, and thus again reducing future reliance on external debt. Okay, so I'll pause here again. So I know that there aren't a ton of level of service options to really consider for water and wastewater assets, but happy to answer any questions and receive any feedback as council may have.
Okay, thank you, Sudhay. Any comments or questions? Deputy Mayor Dickert.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just on the water and wastewater funding, if I was understanding that correctly, it looks like our fees are keeping up pretty much where they need to be. So when we do get additional grants from provincial and federal governments, how does that play into those calculations?
And through you, Your Worship, that's a great question. So all those external funding that's coming in. So as part of the financial modeling, we exclude any external funding that's coming in that's conditional in any way, right? So anything that's non-sustainable in the future is removed from the net operating forecast. For example, if there's any application-based grant funding that's coming in currently into your budget, we remove the effects of that following the completion of the project that it was related to, if it is a multi-year project that needs to be undertaken. So anything that's conditional, application specific is removed from net operating to present a conservative forecast. However, what is included are all the sustainable sources of external funding. So particularly in the case of the town, that is the OMPS funding that's coming in, that's going 100% to fund tax-based operating expenditures. So no effect on capital, it's going 100% to fund tax-based operating. And then also it's the federal gas tax as well as the OSIF allocations, and both of those in every year are being fully allocated to fund tax-based capital expenditure requirements. So none of those are being applied to the water and wastewater side, understanding that water and wastewater assets are well funded, but everything is being applied to the tax funded side.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, I don't see any hands raised, so please continue, Sudhir.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so now we jump into some of the more fun stuff. First, looking at the level of service framework for transportation assets. And really, when we're talking about transportation assets, we're limiting to the roadways as well as some road-related assets, particularly sidewalks and streetlights. But a major component of this is roadways. So here, what you'll see is that the first service attribute, which is accessible and reliable, translates to a level of service statement that stipulates the town striving to maintain its network, transportation network in an adequate condition to enable a comfortable movement of vehicular and pedestrian traffic while minimizing closures of both roadways and sidewalks. Now, how do we translate that to an effect on life cycle management of assets? What we have done is modeled out two scenarios for roads that were determined or identified rather through some workshops that we held with staff. So the base level scenario, which is what you see in the as the first bullet in the third column, is ensuring that road surfaces and subsurface condition is maintained in adequate condition by subjecting every road segment to a resurface every 20 years, so a mill and overlay every 20 years, and then a reconstruction that occurs at the 80-year mark, and it's a full depth reconstruction that occurs at the 80-year mark. Now, that baseline scenario or that life cycle management strategy also includes upgrading all existing road segments to an HCB paved surface. So there's, I think, about, if I'm recalling the number correctly, about 11 or 12 kilometers of roadways in the town that are LCB paved surface. So at the time of reconstruction of those road segments, they would be upgraded to an HCB paved surface. Now, with respect to safe and regulatory, the level of service statement there is that the town strives to ensure that all minimum maintenance standards of particularly Ontario Regulation 23902 related to sidewalks and roadways are either met or exceeded. And really, there's no impact on the capital side of the model related to this, but there may be some impact to the operating side of the model if there are current deficiencies that exist on that side that aren't allowing the town to fix potholes, for example, within the specified timelines, or clear sidewalks within the specified timelines specified in the minimum maintenance standard. So no effect on capital related to safe and regulatory. For affordable, of course, the town is striving to minimize the cost of maintaining transportation assets by maximizing their service life and ensuring uneconomical repair and maintenance costs are avoided to the extent possible. So really that, again, relates back to the life cycle management strategy that we are employing for road segments, where each road segment is undergoing a resurface every 20 years prior to a reconstruction at the 80-year mark. And through workshops with staff, it was determined that that is an appropriate way to maximize the service life of road segments, thereby minimizing the average annual life cycle cost. And then sustainability for transportation assets really relates to proactive planning for asset renewal activities, while also striving to minimize any negative impacts on the environment caused by these transportation assets. Moving into facilities, accessible and reliable, which you see there at the level of service statement is that the town strives to maintain its facility components in an adequate condition to minimize facility shutdown for portions of facilities that are being shut down, while also aligning its facility space with the service needs of its community and the operational needs of staff. So as we undertook the workshops with staff, what was highlighted is that there are some current deficiencies related to insufficient storage space, particularly for public works and recreation equipment, or the storage of that equipment. The baseline level service scenario that we have modeled actually includes the addressing of these storage space limitations by adding approximately 5,600 square feet of additional storage space as the baseline scenario. For safe and regulatory, we want to ensure that all facilities fully comply with the Ontario Building Code, and also, to the extent possible, comply with the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And in that sense, we want to ensure that there are timely completions of rehabilitation and replacement activities related to all facility components, thereby reducing any chance for non-compliance with the Ontario Building Code. And then to the extent possible through the operating budget, the target would be to maximize compliance with AODA, understanding that it's likely not feasible to address everything in any one given year, but it is, to the extent possible, maximize that compliance with the AODA over time. And then again, similar to roadways, affordability really is measured by how much we're able to extend the service life of facility components, so that we're reducing that annual funding target as much as possible, and then also avoiding any uneconomical repair and maintenance costs through ensuring the timely rehabilitation and replacement of facility components. And then lastly, sustainability is measured through regular reviews of facility components to proactively identify any problem assets, any poor performing assets, and proactively plan for their replacement. So really that's how we're approaching that sustainability piece for assets. And then also to incorporate environmental sustainability metrics into long-term capital planning and consider replacing existing assets with more environmentally friendly alternatives. So net zero construction, if any expansion activities are being planned for, or replacing existing components with some more environmentally friendly options at the time of their replacement. So that's something certainly for council to consider, but not something that has been modeled into the outputs that we're presenting today. And for stormwater assets, again, stormwater assets are much the same as underground water and wastewater assets, where alternative levels of service aren't really recommended for these assets. However, we of course want to be able to minimize service disruptions due to unexpected asset failures, and we would do that by ensuring the timely completion of rehabilitation and replacement activities related to all stormwater assets. The one item to note here is that the town, for safe and regulatory, the town strives to maximize the number of properties resilient to both 5-year and 100-year storms. And for the 5-year storms, it would be through workshops with staff, it was determined that any properties that exist on HCB road segments that have curb and gutter attached would be resilient to a 5-year storm. So as road segments come up for reconstruction and are to be replaced, they are being replaced or forecasted to be replaced with curb and gutter. And so that's how we are approaching that resiliency to a 5-year storm piece, is that over time, as all roads get converted to HCB, and then all those HCB roads through reconstruction get in place curb and gutter, then hopefully we are maximizing the number of properties resilient to a 5-year storm pretty well close to 100%. And then finally, some sustainability and affordability impacts. Again, so for affordability, we want to be able to maximize the service life of assets by ensuring timely replacements. And for sustainability, it would be to incorporate some environmental sustainability metrics into long-term capital planning and consider usage or maximizing the usage of any green assets, any natural assets, low impact development practices in the management of stormwater. So again, not something that has been specifically been modeled out as part of the outputs presented today, but certainly something for council consideration, and happy to receive council's direction in that regard. Excuse me. So for fleet and equipment assets, accessible and reliable. First and foremost, we're striving to minimize the number and impact of unplanned repair and maintenance activities performed on fleet and equipment assets. So how do we do that? It's similar to the previous asset classes, where we're ensuring timely replacement of all fleet and equipment assets while prioritizing the replacement of more critical assets first. Safe and regulatory is measured through the various different inspections that are happening to assets, either on an annual basis or, in the case of some heavy equipment, circle checks that happen prior to each use, and some items related to sustainability and affordability that are much in the same vein as the previous asset classes. Now, one thing that is different for fleet and equipment assets, as well as the next section, which is parks and recreation, is that when we did the analysis for these two asset categories, we did discover that there was a fairly large backlog of fleet and equipment assets, as well as parks and recreation assets. So the recommendation there would be to first confirm that those assets are actually poor performing, because currently that backlog is determined by reviewing the age profiles of assets. So we compared the current age of assets to their expected useful service life, and any asset that is currently in service beyond its expected useful service life gets identified as a backlogged asset. So there's a lot of these assets that do exist within the inventory. However, that certainly is not a cause for concern, and certainly is not something foreign to other municipalities as well. What that does mean, however, is that there needs to be some level of confirmation of whether or not these assets are actually poor performing and should belong in the backlog. And if they don't, then we should consider revising the expected useful service life of these assets, because it does seem like those assets are, if they're not in poor condition, then they're outperforming their currently stated expected useful service life. Now, it is for council's consideration and direction to be provided to us in terms of the time period in which council would like to address this backlog of fleet and equipment assets. So currently, the entire backlog is being addressed in year one. And I believe, as we'll step through some of the next slides, is about $6.5 million of backlogged assets that are being replaced fully in year one. Now, understanding that likely will not align with market conditions. Even if you wanted to buy $6.5 million of assets, they might not be available in the market. And further complicating things might be staff operational capacity. So it really is up for council to determine the time period to replace those assets. The timing of those replacements would not affect the tax levy increases or the tax rate increases, for that matter. However, they would impact the reserve balance, as well as how much external debt is being taken on to fund capital expenditures that cannot be funded through other funding sources, including reserves. We'll skip over parks and recreation. Again, it's modeled much in the same way as fleet and equipment assets, with the one caveat here with respect to levels of service being proximity to neighborhood parks and town-operated trails. So much in the same way as underground water and wastewater assets, or all water and wastewater assets and stormwater assets, how we want to maintain current coverage, but that might mean that we need to in place new assets as growth occurs to maintain that percentage. It's the same sort of idea, overarching concept for proximity to neighborhood parks and town operated trails. So we're trying to maintain the current proximity, understanding that more infrastructure may need to be in place to support growth, which would be further assessed more comprehensively through the development charges background. Okay, so then jumping into the level of service options for transportation. So as I mentioned before, we did go through a workshop with staff where we identified these levels of service options. The baseline scenario, which represents an annual funding target of approximately $2.65 million annually, requires road segments to undergo 3 rounds of resurfacing, which is a mill and overlay, every 20 years prior to a full depth reconstruction occurring at year 80. Now, there was an alternative level of service scenario that was discussed with staff as well as modeled as part of the analysis. And the alternative level of service scenario requires road segments to undergo 2 rounds of microsurfacing and 1 round of resurfacing. So it's actually a microsurface first, then a resurface, and then another microsurface prior to a full depth reconstruction happening at year 60. Now, of course, the gain in quality of the roadways following a microsurface is much lower than the gain in quality or gain in condition following a resurface. And so this lifecycle management strategy is expected to maintain the road network in a lower overall condition and provide a lower quality of roadways relative to the baseline scenario, which would typically result in a more noticeable level of both surface and subsurface defects, and thereby reducing ride quality. Both these scenarios, however, do include the full conversion of all 8 LCB roads to HCB surface at the time of reconstruction. When we look at what this translates to in terms of the capital expenditure forecast in uninflated 2025 dollars, you'll see the various different capital expenditures happening as part of the blue bars throughout the next 10 years. The first 5 years of the capital forecast are informed directly through the town's current 5-year capital plan, and the remaining years in the forecast are forecasted based on road condition. And then what you'll see in the green dashed line is the baseline funding target for the higher level of service scenario at the $2.65 million annually. And then the alternate level of service scenario sitting $500,000 below that at approximately $2.15 million annually. For tax funded facilities, again, we undertook some workshops with staff where a requirement for expansion of a public works and recreation facility space was identified. The baseline scenario addresses some space limitations that were identified by staff associated with the storage of both public works and recreation equipment. And as I mentioned previously, it results in adding in approximately 5,600 square feet of additional space to store that equipment, and it's resulting in an annual funding target of approximately $1.76 million annually. There is an alternate level of service scenario that we did model out for council consideration, and it certainly increases levels of service well beyond the baseline scenario, which is resulting in approximately 22,000 square feet of additional space, particularly for recreation. So it's up to council's discretion to determine the way in which that expansion would happen, so whether that's an expansion to an existing facility or the construction of a brand new one. But based on the modeling that we did conduct, that increase of about $170,000 annually would allow a construction or expansion of approximately 22,000 square feet of a recreational facility space that really does increase the current level of service that's being provided. Of course, both scenarios ensure the timely replacements and rehabilitations of all facility components. And so for the baseline forecast, which is addressing the storage limitations, what you'll see here is the regular capital expenditures related to existing facilities happening in the base of the bars in blue. And then layered on top of that in 2027 and 2028 are the facility expansions that are spread out evenly over the cost of which are spread out evenly over the 2 years. The annual funding target in this baseline scenario, again, sits at $1.76 million, which considers the full life cycle of all the various different individual facility components. These capital expenditures are forecasted based on the age profile of the facility components, and then, as is the case with other asset classes, further supplemented with the town's current 5-year capital forecast. And what you will see happening in 2026 as well as 2027 is there's a sort of spike in capital expenditure requirements. Just the base of the bars is spiking quite high in those years, and that's related to the police services building construction. Now, of course, everything that you see here in this slide and the next one related to facility expansion, so everything in this sort of lighter blue, yellow color rather, is an estimate based on the current replacement value of existing facilities. So certainly, it's not our intent to present these costs as fully representative of what the actual construction cost of those expansions would be. Certainly, those costs should be reassessed through a formal procurement process if council would like to expand facilities, but just to provide a sort of base level understanding or a high level understanding of what this expansion might look like with respect to its initial capital investment requirement. We have provided some estimates here. And then the alternate scenario, as I mentioned before, increases levels of service well beyond the baseline, increases the funding target by approximately $170,000 to $1.93 million. And the cost of the facility expansions, again, is based on the current replacement value of existing facilities, which is happening evenly over 2029 and 2030. For other tax-funded assets, we've provided the capital expenditure forecast. There's not a ton of level of service changes to consider for these assets, other than the major one being how do we want to address the backlog or the replacement of the approximately $6.5 million of backlogged assets. So currently in the forecast, again, to present a conservative forecast, so this is the worst case scenario. All those replacements are happening in 2026, but certainly if some of those assets are not at the end of their life cycle and are not in poor condition, then perhaps some of that cost can be spread out over later years, which thereby then reduces reliance on future debt and hopefully, reduces reliance on debt and hopefully leaves some additional dollars in tax-funded capital reserves as well. It's just that timing issue, but it, as I mentioned before, wouldn't affect the tax rate or tax levy increase percentages. The annual funding target for these 4 other asset classes sits at close to $2 million, considering the full life cycle of all these assets. And when we bring this all together for all assets, we see that the annual funding target combined for all the town's infrastructure assets sits at just under $6.4 million annually. And then we layer on the other side of the equation. So far, we've talked again a lot about the expenditure side. Now we layer on the funding side, and the capital funding capacity informed through the 2025 budget for the town currently sits at approximately $3.5 million. And for tax-funded assets, it comprises 4 components. The first being the transfer payments. So those are the sustainable external grants, the HOSTF funding allocations, as well as the CCBS, which is the federal gas tax funding allocation, amounting to approximately $800,000 or 25% of the pie, 23% of the pie. There are some debt payments also that are included in the $3.5 million. Now it's both internal and external debt payments that inform the capital funding capacity, because those internal debt payments really amount to additional transfers into reserves. So we did want to represent that as sort of a separate item, because I'm sure that's how council is used to seeing it. But really, those internal debt payments can in effect be lumped in with the contribution to capital reserve amount. And the contribution to capital reserves amount sits at approximately $800,000 as well. And then finally, the fourth and final component of the $3.5 million is the contribution to capital from the tax levy, which represents the amount of capital expenditures in 2025 that are going to be funded directly from the tax levy, which was, I believe, at approximately $1.16 million in 2025. So what you'll see on the tax funded side, which is in direct contrast to the water and wastewater side, is that there is a life cycle funding gap. When we look at the funding side of the equation and compare and contrast that to the expenditure side of the equation, the first or the former being represented by this white dot and the latter being represented by the green dashed line, there is a difference there of just under $3 million, $2.86 million more specifically. However, what we have done is modeled out the forecast to ensure that that funding gap is eliminated over a 10-year period. So by the end of the 10-year period, you're at full life cycle funding levels, assuming that your sort of current inventory and mix of assets doesn't substantially or materially change over the next 10 years. In which case this funding target will also be amended. So certainly this asset management plan is not set in stone. It very much is a living document that needs to be reviewed and updated at regular frequencies. And certainly this annual funding target, what you see here is the effects of inflation. So this funding target rising throughout the 10-year forecast, but also it may further rise or decline if your inventory of assets also substantially changes. So harkening back to that wastewater control plant expansion, where we saw the annual funding target rise following that expansion, that may occur here as well. So that funding target may rise above what is shown here, which is just the effects of inflation. But of course, the capital funding capacity is aligned with that funding target following the 10 years. And then when we bring this all together, what we're looking at is estimated annual tax levy increases of approximately 7.6% annually, which would then translate into annual tax rate increases of just about 6.4% annually. The other key item to note here is the balance in capital reserves, the year-end balance in capital reserves. So what you'll see is there are a fair bit of expenditures that are happening year over year, which are again represented by the bars that you see there. The base of the bars representing the net operating expenditures subject to only nominal increases based on future inflation or estimates of future inflation. Then there's the capital expenditures that are again characterized by peaks and valleys. And then on top of that are the debt servicing costs. So the principal and interest payments that are going to be required to be made, because what you'll notice when you review the funding side of the equation represented by the three lines that you see there is in that sort of purple line, there is a fair bit of debt that's being taken on in any one given year, because the sum of the tax levy and the transfer payment revenues, as well as what's left in reserves, does not satisfy the overall expenditure requirements for the town. So in all years, actually, there's some debt that's being taken on, and I think that's really important for council's consideration, is that as we look, and we'll get into the debt piece, I think in the next slide or the one after, but it does look like there's a fair bit of debt that's being taken on, and on the flip side, not a lot left in capital reserves. So what you'll see is following year one, the capital year-end balance and capital reserves is sitting at the recommended minimum balance threshold. to here, which is approximately $825,000. So that minimum balance threshold is modeled as the 10% of the average capital expenditures over the 10-year period. So that amounts to approximately $825,000. And throughout 2026 to 2035, it's sitting at that minimum balance threshold amount. And of course, as you'll see in the note here, that there is a increased reliance on debt because in the short to medium term, the capital funding capacity is not up to the level of the capital expenditure requirements that are needed to maintain assets in their current condition. Now, what does this all translate into for the average house assessed at $220,000? So currently, that house assessed at $220,000 would pay approximately $2,476 in municipal taxes. Those monies are allocated 75% to fund operating costs and 25% to fund capital costs. Now, year over year, as I mentioned before, this modeling exercise for the baseline scenario includes increases of approximately 6.4% annually, which results in approximately $160 of additional tax levy in 2025. Now, in 2025, the effects of some conditional grants that were coming in have been taken out. And so you'll see a larger share of those monies being allocated towards operating costs versus capital costs in year one. But you do see that over time, a larger and larger share of the tax bill does get allocated towards funding capital costs till it I think arrives at reaches a pretty healthy level, which is, you're looking for that 50-50 split, but it really is reaching a pretty healthy level with respect to the town's inventory by the end of the 10 years. Of course, in those in the middle of the forecast, you are subject to approximately 6.4% increases annually. And then we look at the debt side of the equation. So this is sort of the first thing that jumps out is there is a fair bit of debt that's being taken on. And what you'll see in this graph is the bars represent the annual repayment limit for the town. So of course, every municipality in Ontario is subject to a debt ceiling, which is mandated or legislated by the province. That debt ceiling is that in any one given year, debt servicing costs, which are principal and interest payments, cannot exceed 25% of the prior year's own source revenues. So that is represented in the bars here, where the bars represent what the prepayment limit is, so how much debt and interest you can pay in any one given year. In the base of the bars in blue is how much of that debt capacity is actually being utilized. So in 2026, we're starting at a fairly low amount of 2.2%. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, there's a fair bit of backlogged assets that are being all funded in 2026. And if I can go back to this chart here, you do see a fair bit of debt being taken on in 2026. However, it is expected that even though that debt is being issued in 2026, the debt servicing costs actually don't come online till the year after. So that's why in 2027, we see the debt utilization start rising and rising up to a maximum here of about 16.5%. So it still leaves about 8.6% of capacity remaining, but it is something that would need to be closely monitored, especially when we consider the impact of any debt that's associated with the wastewater control plant expansion. So that impact is going to be further assessed through development charges study, is not included here, and quite frankly might not be fully formalized prior to that expansion actually taking place. So really the important thing to consider here is the timing of when that wastewater control plant expansion would occur versus the timing of the collection of development charges. And typically there is a bit of a misalignment to when those development charges are collected versus when the initial capital costs are expected to be expended. And so even though development charges will fully recover those costs in the short term, there may be some issuance of debt that's required. So that isn't fully fleshed out at this stage. Now, I know that was a fair bit of information. So to sort of distill this down into some level of service consideration that we have identified, of course, with the alternate level of service scenario for facilities, that actually increases the annual funding target. The alternate level of service scenario for roads, which represents the most significant reduction to the annual funding target. There's also built into that baseline scenario, the expansion of facility space to address current storage deficiency. So that can be removed, which marginally brings down the funding target. And then we may choose to actually, instead of expanding any facility space, reduce space. So here, the example that's given is a reduction of recreation facility space by approximately 28,000 square feet, which reduces the funding target by approximately $275,000. And what you'll see here is the tax bill impact associated with all of those scenarios. So our baseline scenario starts at $2,476 and rises to a tax bill of just under $4,600 by 2035. If we were to not consider, or if we were to implement the alternate level service scenario for transportation, we were to not expand facility space at all, and we were to further reduce recreation facility space by 25%, it would actually reduce that $4,600 in 2035 to just under $4,300 in 2035. In terms of the tax rate, that range is, at the baseline level service scenario, approximately 6.4%, all the way down to approximately 5.66% if all those level service options are amended. The other one that might be relevant here is it's the one just above the 5.66, it's at 5.91, which does not actually include the reduction of any facility space, but does involve the alternate level of service scenario for transportation and also foregoing the expansion of any facility space to address storage limitations, so 5.91 in that scenario. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. But at this stage, happy to answer any questions and receive your feedback on the level of service options, as well as your direction on any other options to consider.
Thank you, Sudhir. Very good presentation, clear and to the point. Makes you think a lot about what we're doing. Council, questions, comments? Even staff, if you want to have a question at this time. Chris, go ahead.
Sudhir, just to verify that 2035, that 10-year is to get rid of the full gap. What if council wants to spread that longer than the 10 years? What if they wanted it 20
Absolutely.
years? Is that possible?
Absolutely. So that certainly is the other major lever to pull. So the first lever to pull would be the level of service targets. The other lever to pull is how long we actually want to take to eliminate this funding gap. Understanding that the longer that we take, the more of an effect that's going to have on a negative effect that's going to have on our reserve balance, which is already at the minimum balance threshold, and an effect on the debt being taken on, which again is already or forecasted to be at a pretty substantial amount. But we certainly can extend that time period. So if council would like to see that funding gap closed over a 15-year period, let's say, or a 20-year period, let's say, there's nothing specific in OREC 58817 that prevents a municipality from doing that. It's just understanding that there are some negative financial impacts to that decision. And of course, by the end of the 10-year forecast, you're not fully eliminating your funding gap. So there still is a funding gap that remains at the end of that, at the end of the 10-year forecast, but certainly nothing in the OREG that will prevent any municipality from extending the time to eliminate the funding gap.
Okay, Chris. Councillor Cable.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just wondering, and thank you very much for the presentation. we're talking about a $6.5 million funding backlog of capital assets, and wondering, is that coming directly from our 5-year forecast, or where's the $6.5 million backlog coming from? And also, is there a prioritized list? So if we were to not go ahead with all $6.5 million in 2026, is there a prioritized list that you'd be able to select from?
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer your second question first, there is a list that is prioritized now. The reason why I would suggest a confirmation of whether these assets are actually performing poorly and do represent a backlog is because this backlog really is identified through your inventory of assets, right? So we're not looking at the 10-year capital plans or any forecasts that the town currently has. We simply evaluate the inventory as it exists in the town's asset management software, which is citywide. So in that inventory, each asset, and I do want to commend the town and particularly town staff for having a really comprehensive asset inventory. There's a fair bit of work that has been gone into the development of that inventory, and certainly the inventory as it's structured today is very much reflective of that work that has gone in. But through that inventory, every single asset has an age associated with it, as well as an expected useful service life associated with it. For any asset where the age exceeds its expected useful service life, they would be identified as a backlog asset. So really, it's based on the age relative to useful service life, but and then that's why I think it really highlights the need to conduct some on-the-ground condition assessments to really evaluate whether they belong in the backlog or not.
Councillor Cable,
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Your Worship. So that assessment of the assets has not happened as part of this coming up with a $6.5 million figure?
No, so that is a little bit outside of the scope of our work. It really would be, the onus would be on either staff or other hired consultants to evaluate the current condition of those assets. So on the ground condition of those assets, that is a little bit out of the scope of the nature of our work.
Just if I can add, and Chris clarify, but part of the things that we do annually as part of our asset review is the directors are to be reviewing our assets and the conditions and updating those accordingly within our system. So that has somewhat been done. Could it be done further a bit more? I would think that's an option, but annually that assessment or that condition assessment is to be being completed by our staff accordingly. Correct, Chris?
Through you, Your Worship. Sherry is correct and Sudhir is correct. Right now, we have over the $6 million that's showing in our assets that are long past due. All that information is given to each director when they're looking at putting in their capital for the following year. They'll look at it, they'll see the risk. If the risk isn't as high, even though it's past that gets pushed off for another year. And that's why the other ones come forward when they do. So we don't really look at the gap. The other option is today, we don't have to do all those in 2026. They can pick and choose which ones they want to do. It's just brought to your attention that there's over $6 million in assets. So we have to stop trying to do new things and trying to focus on our existing assets before we keep moving on to other areas is what it's trying to come at. But each year, each director has the opportunity to look at all their backlog, what's there. They can say, no, I don't need that. That's not a priority for us. This is more a priority.
And if I can just just to add to that is that I think I've been hearing the word infrastructure deficit, which is backlog, for, I don't know, 8+ years around this table at budget time. So again, backlog, infrastructure deficit, that's exactly what it's getting at, is the fact that we have not replaced our assets based on our asset management plan. And here's where we find ourselves.
Councillor Cable, I'm going to go back to you. Was your questions answered? And do you have any more?
Yes, I think the question was answered, and I don't know, perhaps it's something that we want to look at, doing an actual evaluation of these. I was kind of assuming that was part of it. I think my concern before we started the study was, for example, the police station was not on our radar for replacement, and all of a sudden we're going to put $7.5 million into that asset. So just wanting to make sure that our list is actually accurate. And the $6.5 million, is it really $10 million? Like, I guess I'm just hoping that our numbers are somewhat accurate if we haven't really taken a look at those.
Okay, thank you. Chris, response?
Through you, your worship, if you wish, I can give you a list of the full backlog assets that are out there so that you're aware of them. But there's a lot of them if you want the full list. But that's what the directors are taking a look at all the time, and it's their direction to go this way and based on council's decisions as well. The fire or the police station is part of the backlog too. It's a very old building. The conditions push it up further, but as Sudhay is talking about, he's talking about life cycle. So if it's supposed to last 20 years, it's now 30 years into it. Why is it not there? There's also others that are saying they could last 50 years and it's now only 30 years and they're going by the wayside. So that's where we do our condition assessments, and that's why that's brought forward to each department to take a look at it.
Andrew?
Through your worship, yeah, maybe we, if whether we provide a list of the backlog items or that replacement is built into more years and spread out, whatever that option may be. I don't want it to give the perception that this wasn't an in-depth review by any means. All that information on AMP or citywide has been used. It's all the information's relevant, and this is a very, very in-depth background and history and a very good milestone point of exactly where we are. It's not just a cursory high-level review by any means. It's it's a bit of an eye-opening snapshot of where a lot of our things are at, and hopefully where we could get to. I don't know if the backlog review of each individual item is something that makes sense, or just saying if there is a backlog of significance, 6 million or whatever that is, maybe it's just something that's looked at spread over or numerous years as opposed to being picked up at one, similar to the 10-year to 2035 that we show on our charts. Maybe that's 2045 or 2038 or 2041.
Anyone else with questions, comments? Councillor Hudson?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just so that I am aware of what I should be. The current storage for public works and rec equipment is where?
I'll start, but so Public Works has their workshop in the business park. Parks and Recreation storage from a parks perspective is in behind 140th 7th Avenue. So that's the ambulance and physiotherapy. There's a separate workshop area that's behind there. And it's kind of, I call it parks, but it is used for various storage, because the P&H Center as well, the back end there, it depends on the season, right? Some of the equipment, so when we don't need the Olympia, it goes to the parks storage, and then our parks equipment comes to the P&H Center. So it's mostly at 147th Ave with some at P&H Center, pending the timing of the year.
So when they're talking about the square footage building, would that be a separate building to house both of those things then? I'm just trying to get a little clarity on this. And are we, stacking things up? Is it a dire situation?
Well, the Parks and Recreation storage is far better than what we used to have prior to having 140th 7th Ave, which has only been in the last 10 years, 12 years, approximately.
Through you, your worship. You've got the public works area. I think they have 4 bays. Is that correct, Ron? 4 bays? They need 5, possibly 6. So they're storing stuff over at 147th Ave in the area, and that area is being now asked to be used by the physiotherapy. So now we're going to lose that storage area again. And as Sherry had mentioned, there's a little shed that the Parks and Rec uses, but everything else is sitting outside out in the elements and they have to pull things in and out, and none of their equipment other than one piece can be stored at any one time. And I'm sure you have more than one piece of equipment that's in there. And they're doing, like you say, stacking, pulling things in, moving this over here, moving out. The object was, if in our long-winded thinking in the future, if we don't need that area back there, once the water tower goes, it's to house both the Parks and Rec and the Public Works at the same location and just add another facility in there. So then everybody's stuff is all in one area. That's the thought, and using the proceeds from that to probably pay for most of that. That's our understanding. And I think the other place was the Binkley Pavilion that they're looking at doing. There was also thought that we should have another pavilion because of all these other activities that are happening, possibly at the soccer field or somewhere else at that point. That's what that other 22,000, I think it was. I think Laura will clarify all that.
Yeah, through your worship, everything that Chris just said, correct. And relating to the pavilions, it is identified at the rail lands or the soccer field. So currently, right now, we have a CCAN, and we have a washroom that is, doesn't quite meet today's standards, particularly relating to accessibility. So the overarching plan there would be to add some type of a pavilion that would include accessible washrooms, storage, and perhaps a little bit of a concession stand there, and just a covered sort of pavilion. So the typical pavilion.
So when they talk about reduce the rec space by 25%, what does that look like? What is that speaking to?
Perhaps Suday could ask that one. I think that's the one, Suday, we said about adding the additional one at the rail lands, right?
Yeah, through your worship. So what is, I think a little falling a little bit outside of the scope of the work that we're doing is identifying the specific facilities that would be subject to either consolidation or full disposal or reduction in facility space. However, the way that the model has been developed, it really is agnostic to what facility gets reduced. So it really is up to council's discretion in terms of how they want to approach the facility space reduction question. What we have done is of course, specify what a 25% reduction would look like in terms of a reduction of the annual funding target, which reduces the funding target by approximately $275,000. Now that's a bookend, right? So even though it says 25% here, it may be very well that council decides to only reduce 10% or only about 5%, in which case the reduction to the annual funding target is less, but there is some reduction to the funding target. So certainly we're not here to prescribe a plan for what a consolidation of facility space might look like in the future. That certainly is for staff and council's discretion to determine. But the way that the modeling is done is really is agnostic to what facilities get consolidated or reduced. It just highlights what that funding target reduction would be if facility space was to be reduced by a certain amount of gross floor area. That makes sense.
Councillor Hudson, anything further? Councillor Fleet.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you again for this report. I just have a couple questions. Going transportation level of road service. Now, we share some of our roads with the county. Has that been brought into play when it comes to the costing?
Through your worship, yes. So I believe the town currently manages approximately 45 or so kilometers of roadways that are fully under the care and control of the town, and for which the town is responsible for all capital investment requirements. And so those the inventory of roadways is only reflective of that 40, I believe the exact number is 44.725 kilometers of roadways that are under care and control of the town.
Alrighty, and then my other question, along with Counselor Hudson, storage and space deficiency, and this is something I might have staff. Do we need to do an inventory of our supplies and equipment and remove unused equipment? Like, is there abundance of equipment or unused supplies that we can be rid of to make more space?
Through your worship, I mean, as far as the Parks and Rec related, it's not as though we have a graveyard of equipment that's not being used. Supplies, that might be more of a Public Works related. We wouldn't keep most of our supplies wouldn't be kept off-site for the most part. I guess it depends, because I suppose there would be some supplies, lime or
Well, just a way of trying to find more space, and I'm just, I don't know if Ron has extra space over there. I drive by, see an old float from the Santa Claus parade sitting in the back of the parking lot, which is, would probably never be used again. Does it need to be there?
That's outdoor space. That's free. There's no charge for that. But I would just say at Public Works alone, we have equipment which we're using in the summer, which is a sweeper. We don't even have room to put it inside. It's up at 147th Ave, stored there. When winter's over and comes the summer, we got a greater piece of machine. It sits outside till winter, so we do not have enough storage right now to store all our equipment. When it comes time to get the equipment out and use it for winter maintenance on a daily basis, we're moving a couple of pickup trucks and a 1-ton truck out of the garage right now, so we can get our winter equipment out to use them on a daily basis. One of the pieces of a pickup truck, people are taking it home now to use it as a patrol truck. Was at the workshop now, there's not enough space for it anyway, so stuff's angled in there every which way we can get it, and we don't have enough room. We juggle stuff around all the time. That's what the space requirements are.
And then one more question here. This may be a question for Sudhir.
Counselor Fleet, can I just, before, I think Andrew had a comment to go along with Ron's.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. And yeah, just to build on that, we're pretty cognizant every year, once or twice a year, going through our inventory and what's needed and what's not, and noting it as surplus and putting it on, gov deals or however we need to dispose of those items. So we do that, at least once a year, more than one time a year.
Thank you. Counselor Fleet.
Yeah, just a thought I had. I'm sure all staff does, like at every department level. My other question is, and we've been through this a few times, and as a service community and a hub, should we be looking at any type of user fees to support operations of our services? Our facilities are being highly used by residents of other communities, with financial support coming from the taxpayers of Hanover. I don't know if this is something that we should look at, or is this something we should just let go by?
Yeah, through you, Your Worship. I think that's an excellent point. And that I think alerts me to perhaps two items that might be worthwhile to consider for council. The first, I think we are referring to, if I'm correct, Councillor, is a user fee review. So certainly, I believe currently there are some charges for the usage of recreation facilities and whatnot. But I think a review of how those fees perhaps compare to other municipalities, as well as whether or not they actually represent full cost recovery, that might be something worthwhile to consider. And if they don't represent full cost recovery, then to also for council to decide to what level should they be subsidized, right? So it might not be palatable to have those fees implemented at a full cost recovery basis, and so there might be some subsidization that would be appropriate from the tax levy to bring those fees down, but it might not be at a sustainable level currently. So certainly a user fee review might be something worthwhile, and not just in the case of user fees, but I think it's worthwhile for administration as well as council to explore all opportunities to increase the amount of revenues coming in through any sort of sources. Certainly application for grant funding to mitigate some of the funding requirements for capital. That's a worthwhile consideration, but any avenue in which more money can come into the town would be something certainly that would be worthwhile exploring. And then the other piece that I think would be food for thought and something to consider is really the development of a long-term financial plan. So as I mentioned previously, the asset management plan is dealing with the capital side for the town. It's resolving a lot of really nuanced items related, but all related to capital. What we haven't done is go through operating in a comprehensive enough manner to understand where are your current deficiencies, how much are expenditures expected to grow, what are the main factors or driving factors of that growth, how much are revenues expected to increase, what what scenarios can we sort of look to model to increase the revenues that are coming in. So I think that's a really good suggestion, Councillor, that a user fee review be undertaken, and something to also consider would be to develop a long-term financial plan following the development of this asset management plan. So you really have a good comprehensive model that is more prescriptive rather than just illustrative or predictive, that incorporates both operating and capital.
Thank you, Sudhir. Sherry?
So just to clarify, Councillor Fleet, when you say user fees, are you speaking about non-resident user fees?
I'm just talking user fees in general. That would be included in that, I would think. I know we've had user fees for recreation facilities and that in the past, but I'm just looking at all revenues of generating, funds for our community, municipality.
Okay, so if I can have two further comments. So non-resident fees did exist at one time, as you're aware, and I believe it was in 2015 that council chose to remove those user fees, of which a number of you were around that table at that time. The other thing around the user fee review, we did do a user fee review in 2018, Chris? 2017, 2018. We did do an internal user fee review where we did show council the levels of subsidy based on our calculations, and then asked for council's direction at that time about what did you want to see the level of service subsidy be, to which the direction was to maintain our current method of user fees. So we have done parts of that previously, not to say we can't do it again from a review standpoint, but just providing some historical stuff that we have done accordingly.
Councillor Hawking.
Thank you, Worship, and thank you for this excellent report. I really appreciated your presentation. I'd just like to make a comment on user fees. Number one, when you start charging people outside of Hanover a user fee, you're going to find out that your net revenue will go down, because people were going to say, I'm not going to pay any extra. And I think the whole idea when we built that pool, the idea was to attract people into our community because they just don't spend money at the pool. They spend money at restaurants, shopping, and everything else. So that's my first point. The second point was, when we did the strategic plan and we said, if you had to pay for services, what's your number one choice of paying for those services? They said increase user fees as opposed to increases by tax rate. Now, having said that, there's a point in which it becomes prohibited for some people when you jack up the user fee to the point that they can't even afford, because they don't have the money for the increased user fees. So maybe you're looking at a subsidization based on income or something, but I think user fees is a good way to go. However, there are a few cautions you should be worried about. I know I raised it at budget time, increase certain programs where there's adults who can afford it. However, everybody doesn't want to do that. I think you need a comprehensive user fee study where we gain revenue, but at the same time, and I don't know how you do this, how you don't make it negative for some of the people who for various reasons. I remember back when I was in the rec board back in the 80s, I'm going back, and Mike Dunlop shared this with me. Minor hockey was considering they talked about increasing the cost for hockey for children or young adults. So let's say they had 150 paying, they jacked the prices up, and it ended up with 75. So in the end, there was no more increase in income because people will vote not to participate. So there's a fine line where your revenue doesn't necessarily attribute directly to increased user fees. However, well, I'm finished. So.
And Laura, can you comment? Did we not do this at budget time? We looked at other facilities and our fees and how we compared to them?
Yes, we certainly did in 2024. So we took a look at neighboring municipalities as well as some municipalities that shared similar facilities and population base. And I believe that was I think that comparison was provided to council, Chris. I think it was that in part of the one of the budget agenda packages. I just couldn't confirm which one it is. So it is very recent. It was just in November probably of 2024.
Yeah, I believe it was for a finance committee meeting. So we do have that information. Chris.
If we can go back to today's question there for levels of consideration, I would think we don't want the alternate level of service scenario for facilities to add another 170,000. So I would imagine the council would want to strike that one off right now. That was the alternative service. To expand the facility space to address current storage space facilities. You've got down there, Sujay, 50,000. Which one is that for? Is that for the rail lands? Or is that to increase over at the public works area? Because I'm thinking that we wouldn't put them over at the public works area until we actually sold that place. So there wouldn't be any actual extra tax money that you would need for that. You would sell an asset to create a new asset. So that really shouldn't be part of this funding. That's just me thinking out loud. If anyone's thinking along that lines.
Through your worship, perhaps I can ask a question, Christine. So what's the name of the facility that would be removed to accommodate the expansion?
There wouldn't be one removed. We would be selling an asset.
Right. So
Potentially.
So again, through your worship. So in that sense, as I mentioned before, the model is agnostic to what specific facility or location the expansion occurs at, unless there is an asset that's coming off the books that is currently in the inventory. The annual funding target would still be at that $50,000. So currently it's included in the baseline scenario at $50,000. We can choose to remove it from the baseline scenario. It'll move that annual tax rate increases up, I think, a couple of basis points. So it might actually not be worthwhile to look at this option because it does seem like that expansion of facility space to address at least just the storage concerns of additional 5,000 square feet is actually the most economical level of service option that is presented to you today, and it would represent a increase in the level of service, certainly from an operational capacity standpoint. But to directly answer your question, Chris, it's agnostic to location or what facility. Just is highlighting that if you increase GFA, gross floor area, by approximately 5,600 square feet, that's an effect to the annual funding target of $50,000.
Okay, through your worship as well. So keep the 50,000 there. What is that reduced space by 25%? I'm not sure on that. Is that what we're talking about? Removing 147th Ave? Possibly? Because
Yeah.
that's a lot of money, 275,000.
Yeah, so through your worship, again, it's agnostic to what facility space. That really is for council's discretion in terms of what form and format that reduction takes place in. So that might mean consolidating various facilities. It might mean disposing facilities altogether. It might mean reducing GFAs of currently large facilities. So that really is up for council to determine, but it does reduce the annual funding target by $275,000, which is going to materially affect the tax rate increases for sure. And again, as I mentioned previously, it's presented there as sort of a bookend, right? So certainly the suggestion isn't to reduce the recreation facility space by 25%. The intent here is to show you that if you were to reduce it by 25%, you will reduce your annual funding target also by $275,000. And that it does sort of, that relationship is linear, right? So if you were to reduce it by 5%, then the annual funding target would reduce by 1/5 of $275,000. So that relationship very much is linear.
Okay, thanks, Sude. So I'm going to ask Sherry, what's our direction? We're receiving Watson and Associates report for information, but is staff going to come back with a report on the different levels of service considerations so that we can see them listed and what we agree to?
I may have to defer this one to Chris a little bit. My understanding was this evening, we were looking for your comments and direction so that we can confirm the asset management plan accordingly.
Through you, your worship, and Sude as well. We went through all the information. Everything that he's presenting tonight is based on our existing assets and what we require. And then there was talk of possibly a deficiency in some of our storage. Based on what Sude said there, that would mean that we need at least 50,000 for that storage. But I don't think we need that increased annual funding target of 170, but it's not even in there. That was just a level of service. What you need to look at is your roads. Are you wanting everything to HCB? Are you wanting everything curb and gutter? You want everything to a 5-year storm? Or when we go to replace, are you just going to leave them at LCBs and no curb, no gutter, no sidewalks, etc.? Those are the kind of services we're looking at. What he's presented today is exactly what we are doing. And what are your proposed levels of service? Are you wanting to increase this?
Councillor Hawking?
Thank you, Your Worship. There's a lot of stuff here. I would like a reprieve for next council to come back and with our suggestion rather than sit here tonight based on just hearing the presentation and chatting about this, because I'm sure some will have more questions. Is it imperative that we make a decision today?
Through your worship, perhaps I can take a first stab at that question. So certainly the intent today was to have an open discussion with council. And certainly I don't think it was the intent to fully finalize and formalize the proposed levels of service through the discussion we're having today. So perhaps what would be appropriate next steps is to for us to sort of present this to you or rather for staff to come back with a report perhaps, which we can certainly assist with, that presents the level of service options that were described here today. And then through the sort of recommendations that are provided in that report, council can at that time decide what are the levels of service or the proposed levels of service that should make their way into the asset management plan. So completely understand that this is a lot of information to take in, especially if you're reviewing this for the first time this comprehensively. And certainly I would expect there to be some takeaway and consideration prior to a formal decision being made. So today really the intent was to have an open discussion. Perhaps if both council and administration agrees, this can come back as a staff report for council to make a formal decision on.
Thank you. Sherry?
I'm just, Sudhir, can I just clarify, just from a timing perspective though, at what point do you need that direction to then finalize this asset management plan update? And maybe that's a Chris question as well. I don't know.
Through your worship, and perhaps I can start again, and Chris can supplement. So on our end, it's a fairly quick process to formalize those levels of service targets. I know we were previously looking at sort of a March or April delivery of the asset management plan final report. Certainly that final report isn't due technically based on the requirements of the OREG till July 1st of 2025. So if at this stage, and this I think is a really important decision point for council, and it is something that is worth the consideration that I think council wants to give it. So certainly, if I would rather sort of delay that March or April timeline to further to give council an ample opportunity to provide to really understand this, digest this appropriately, and then provide some really good direction. On our end, it's a fairly easy sort of incorporation of the level service targets that council provides to us. Certainly following that, there's the development of the AMP report that does take some time. So if I was to provide sort of a drop dead date, I would say, we would in order to meet that July 1st deadline, probably midpoint of May is the latest that we can extend it, so that we have that sort of 6 to 8 weeks to finalize the AMP report. But certainly it's up to staff and council's discretion in that regard.
Well, I was just, the information's current in your mind now. I don't think we want to leave this too long is what I would suggest as my recommendation. Finance committee isn't scheduled to meet again until April 28th, which again, I believe is perhaps a little bit too late, but council, help us out here as staff. Like, do you want to meet as a finance committee on March the 24th? And then it's current. We've got information. When I say current, I mean that it's fresh in our minds versus waiting 8 weeks. That would be my suggestion, is that we have a finance committee meeting on March 24th, as opposed to waiting till April 28th, and maybe we forgo the April 28th meeting potentially as a suggestion.
Councillor Cable?
Thank you, Worship. I do have a question, but I will start with a comment. Wondering, could we ever have a finance committee meeting that would be after a existing council or committee of the whole meeting?
So yes, however, we have a plan for a special meeting after the March 17th meeting already with respect to youth retention, workplace and workforce and skills development. So that X's that meeting out, which means we are preparing something for next Monday, which I think is too soon. So that's why I was suggesting the 4th Monday of the month, which aligns with finance committee. Do we need 100%? Not, no. True, we could part it, we could. April 7th.
Councillor Sacco?
Thank you, Your Worship. While we're brainstorming, I'm thinking about the empty fire hall right now. Is there any possibility that, Ron, we could get some public works equipment in there?
Andrew?
Through your worship, maybe for the next 6 months before it gets taken down, but the long term, it doesn't resolve anything.
I'm thinking currently.
So I'm wondering, why can't we do March 10th? It's a Monday.
It's another option.
Like, it's not a scheduled meeting, but what's Deputy Mayor?
Just looking at the considerations that we have here, did I hear it correctly that even if we took all of the reduced level of service options, it was what was the percentage difference that it made?
Yes, through your worship, so including the reduction to recreation facility space, by 25%, we were at 5.66 on the tax rate, not the levy, the tax rate. And if we don't choose not to reduce recreation facility space by any amount, it's 5.91 on the tax rate. And in fact, that rate is does not include any facility expansion, so not addressing the storage limitations as well.
So, and that percentage is the start. That doesn't include anything else. Chris?
Through you, your worship, you're correct. That is all for this capital backlog existing, no future, no growth, no nothing. This is just to get us up to get our gap out of the way. The 6.38 that was there. And that's on there. So really the differences between all them at the end of 10 years, difference of $300. If you look at the quote, so you keep pulling off little Band-Aids at a time. You gotta cut it one time and make a decision. Let's not do it over 10 years. Let's do it over 15. Let's do it over 20. Maybe that 6.38 becomes 3.5% that we have to put aside. Guaranteed, you have to put that aside. Kind of like we did for water and wastewater. We made that decision. Hey, we know we have to go there. Did we not just hear tonight that our water and wastewater is doing well? That we're on the road to what we're doing because we took that step and took the big Band-Aid off and went for it. So this is what we have to do. Keep in mind that the water and wastewater continues to go up each year like we're supposed to. But we need to get to a spot where we need to start, where we put the amounts away and we're guaranteed to put that away. We've been doing really well with our TCA reserve that we started. Remember, we started off 1.5%. We're actually putting in almost 3% away with all the stuff that we're doing, but we need to do just a little bit better. But I think doing it in 10 years, as Sudhay has presented, is a little aggressive. Very, very steep, but it needs to be addressed. Yeah, let's do 3.5, it's guaranteed. And then here's what it is for operation and maintenance that we need to do and continue in that direction. That's what we have to make those steps.
So we need the report showing what that percentage is at, well, we know what 10 years is. We need the 15, we need the 20. Andrew?
Correct. I will have to talk with Sudhay about getting that additional information.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you, Your Worship. No, that was just my question. And I mean, it really is a Chris question, how the report's formulated and to look, similar to options and, here's 10 years, here's 20 years, here's paying for the backlog in year 1, here's spreading it out over 5, here's not doing the outdoor storage expansion. Those are the options I'm assuming that you're looking for to be in front of you so you can make a decision on how this moves forward. Is that right? Is that how you think that's being formulated, Chris?
I'm thinking that way. All these options, if you do this, it's still going to be this amount. Or if you want to expand it 15 or 20 years, maybe that would be a good thing to decide today if you really think that, so that we can come back with some options or say, here's what 10 years, here's what 15, here's what 20 years would do. If we don't make any changes to our existing levels of service, however you wish to increase just for that storage, but nothing else.
Deputy Mayor.
I was just gonna say it, but not just do it, but anyway, I think the level of service considerations here, that there's nothing really that significant there. I think we need to look at that time frame to spread it out. And really, that's the decision that we've got in front of us is how quick we want to do this. I don't think it's really an option of whether we do it or don't do it. It's just how quick we want to do it and how we can manage that tax increase that it's going to result in. So I think that would be what we'd be looking for you to bring back, is just 15, 20 years versus 10 years. And then we would be, because the rest of it, you know, it's really, it's menial. The changes that we are looking at the possibility of making. So that would be my request.
Councillor Fleet.
Thank you, Worship. I'm with Councillor Hawking, Deputy Mayor Dickert. You know, I'd like to see, 20 years. That would be my choice over a 20-year period.
Sorry, Your Worship. I apologize for not following protocol. No, I'm just saying, if you look at if you have three scenarios, you know, you may like 15. I don't think we'll like 10, but it's either between 15 or 20 years. And as Deputy Mayor Dickert said, sometimes it's not that significant when you spread things over a period of time. So I think that's a good move on us being accountable. And as Deputy Mayor Dickert, you don't have a choice. You need to do this. So good luck, Chris.
So Chris, maybe to ask you then, do you think bringing a report back for the March 17th or the April 7th meeting is more, which one's more attainable from that perspective?
I would have to check with Sudai to see how fast that information can get together for us.
But what if we aimed to bring it back no later than April 7th, which
I'll
is
try for the
committee
17th.
the whole?
Definitely try for the 17th.
Yep. Through you,
Oh.
Your Worship.
Go ahead, Sudai.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, and through you, Your Worship. So on our end, the work to sort of complete that sensitivity analysis to highlight what the tax rate increases should be if we're looking to further extend out the timing to close the funding gap. That analysis is fairly straightforward for us to complete now that, you know, we are sort of at the latter stages of the development of the asset management plan. So from our end, certainly there's no obstacles to meeting that March 17th council date. If that really is the major component of the requirement, it's the determination of the or the identification of the tax rate increases.
Thank you. Sherry, anything further?
No, just that by saying no later than April 7th is the intent, from what I was hearing from council at the end of the day, was that we would bring it back as part of an existing council or committee of the whole meeting versus a separate finance meeting.
Councillor Hawking, then Andrew, you're okay? Okay,
Thank
Councillor
you,
Hawking.
Worship. Thank you, Worship. I'm being a bit selfish. I can't make the March meeting, but I can be here on April the 7th. Thank you.
Is everybody here on the 7th? Okay, let's aim for it. You're here, Sherry?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. All right, anything further, Chris, do you need for this report to come back? Okay, give us options. All right, and any further questions for Sudai while we have him? Seeing none, thank you very much, Sudai. Excellent presentation. I don't know if anybody's going to sleep tonight, but we'll be thinking about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if it's any level of comfort, I don't think that this situation is all that foreign to most municipalities in Ontario. I think a lot of municipalities are at this same spot. So if that does provide a level of comfort, so be it. But certainly let you know that you're not alone. And thank you for the time.
Okay, thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Okay, council, let's have our light lunch. We'll
Someone to put the carrots and the cucumbers that are in the fridge on a couple plates, and I'll go get the sandwiches in the firehouse.
So, what time is it? Okay. All right, we're gonna continue. So we're on item 6, business arising from the minutes, and we do not do not have any. Item 7, adoption of the previous minutes. I need a mover and seconder for those. Councillor Cable and Councillor Sacco. That was our Finance Committee meeting minutes from November 25th. That was budget discussion, our first draft and list of possible savings. Seems like a long time ago. So, all in favor unless, okay, that's carried. Thank you. Item 8 is staff reports. The first one is for information, and this is report FIN 0125. Director of Corporate Services, DCS, behind it now. And it is the quarterly financial statement, October to December of 2024. It's from Chris Walker, our Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer. Chris?
Thank you, Your Worship. Excuse me. We provide these financial statements when we have an opportunity to review them with our Finance Committee. So attached to this report is the current Town of Hanover balance sheet, which will give you a quick snapshot of our financial position as at December 31st. We also attach the accounts payable listings for October to December. There is a temporary loan of 5.8 million that was set up for the fire hall under liabilities on the balance sheet that you'll probably see there until the FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, Green Municipal Fund loan and grant is finalized, which is going to be a minimum of 3 to 6 months, and it usually occurs after the project is finalized. But since the solar panels are still outstanding on this project, that will be delayed again until that occurs. The current cost of the fire hall to the end of December, that includes what was spent in 2023 and 2024, is currently at 7.1 million. And additional costs, obviously, for the solar panels, we're assuming about 210. Yet, based on the contract that was there, and a few more miscellaneous items for 2025. The statement of operations currently is showing a surplus of $430,761. Of that amount, that includes a deficit for the launch pad currently of $30,566. There is a surplus in wastewater of almost $315,000 because several of the capital projects have not been completed that were to be financed from the sewer fees. There was about $500,000 and none of that was done. So that money would just go to reserves. So technically we would have been short, but if we actually got it done. But again, we're still waiting on some funding for the March billing to happen. That's why the water currently shows a deficit of 144. And we currently have a surplus at the time I printed this of 289. However, just so you know, $218,800 of that was splash pad donations that showed up as revenue and has to be pulled out because the splash pad is getting done in 2025. So about 218,800 is being transferred to our reserves to cover that expense in 2025, which would leave us about 70,000. I did a quick review this morning and our current surplus is at 61,300. So you can see how things change as we get bills and things get done forward. But again, when we're doing it at the time for the report, this is a snapshot in time that it was. So this is a preliminary view of the current financials and will change, as I've mentioned. And then if there is any surplus or deficit, it will be based on our operating surplus deficit management policy that we have in place. I've also attached the Town of Hanover taxes receivable graph as of December 31st, and we're at about $612,000. Of that amount, about 52,000 is one property, which is planning to be paid off in April. So that's a good thought. We would be actually under if we didn't have that one property. This 612 is approximately 6.7% of our total 2024 levy of $9.1 million, or 4.12% of the overall tax levy that we collect of over $14.850 million, which is the county, school board, DIA, and town levies altogether. So anything under 10% for a municipality is considered very positive at the year end. So we're doing well with our tax collection there. This report provides just a quarterly review of the accounts payable, status of the financial position, and taxes receivable. The balance sheet provides information regarding our fiscal year to date. As I said, it's going to change. Just so you're aware, we did receive the October to December OLG payment of $313,700. So overall, it came in at 1.332, which is about 31,299 more than what we had budgeted of 1.3. Normally, we used to do in the past, the first 100,000 over on OLG would automatically go to our reserve, but we've left it in there to fall out at the bottom because we have a new policy in place for surpluses and deficit. And just so you're aware, both the Library and Police Services Board budgets currently have surpluses. They are separate organizations from the town. So there's about 60,500 from the library and about 132,000 for police that will be transferred to the respective reserves. Just want to remind council, you may remember back during our budget deliberations that every 100,000 in levy is equivalent to $11.48 for every 100,000 assessment. So this amount of $192,500 surplus of the levy that we collected in 2024 for these two organizations is equivalent to $22.10 for every 100,000 in assessment, just so you're aware of that. And the link to strategic plan is our open and responsible government, and recommendation is that you receive this report for information. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to accommodate.
Thank you. Councillor Sacco.
Thank you, Your Worship. Forgive me, Chris, if I've forgotten, but what is the issue with the solar panels? Is it a supply chain?
I would defer that over to our building official.
Andrew?
Thank you, Your Worship. There's not an issue with getting them. They're here. They've been here for months. The issue is just the winter. They'll put them up in the winter if there's been some sun and it's somewhat dry. We just haven't had it.
Other comments, questions? Councillor Cable.
Thank you, Your Worship. So without the solar panels, then is the building not generating as much power as it's using? Like, is that impacting our net zero for 1 year?
Through Your Worship, no, not yet. Obviously, they're not. If they are producing, we're not getting it. They're sitting in a pile. But with that said, until the fire hall receives a final sign off, that's when the clock would start on calculating for a year. Therefore, they have not received the final because the final works aren't done, the solar panels being it. Currently, they have an occupancy permit only, so they can occupy the building, which essentially means they can use it as its intended use right now. So no, that clock will start when we're sure that those are producing as they're supposed to be.
Excellent, thank you.
Other questions, comments? Okay, that was for information. The next report is 8.2. This is internal and external borrowing. It is report FIN 0225. It's from Chris, again, our Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer. And I need a mover and seconder to put this on the floor to highlight it. I have Councillor Hawking and Councillor Fleet. Chris?
Thank you, Worship. During the 2025 budget deliberations, we have provided council and this committee as well with information regarding our current status of all internal and external borrowing. On the next page, you will see the summary that we have there. So internally, we're paying in 2025 approximately $228,000. And externally, once the Fire Hall FCM Green Municipal Fund comes on board, would be about $533,000. Because that FCM is not there, we currently have that infrastructure funding of 5.8, and it's costing close to $17,600 in interest every month until we can get our loan put in place. But we do have enough in the budget for 2025 for almost $419,800 of the loan repayment, which includes interest and principal. And then there was changes in the budget to eliminate the launch pad deficit with that 95,000. So that will clear the $63,405, sorry. So it will be done at the end of 2025 versus 2026. So there'll be that additional 34,000 will be available in 2026 budget to be used elsewhere. The external P&H Center loan will be finished in August of this year, at which time the Trail Bridges loan should commence. We currently borrowed internally from our wastewater reserve fund for the $1,024,000. And as per our debt management policy, anything that exceeds $500,000 should be an external loan and not included as part of our internal borrowing. So right now we have a total of over $2.4 million in outstanding principal that has been borrowed internally from the following reserves and reserve funds. And I've broken it down there in the chart. I don't think I have to go through each one with you. That equals the 2.45. Of that amount, 3 of those loans are coming from our water reserves and water reserve funds. As we know, water and wastewater projects are being undertaken in the next few years that will require more of their respective reserves and reserve funds to be available for that purpose. At the February 3rd meeting, Ron brought forward a report regarding the 7th Ave water tower tender that was presented to council, and it was noted at that time that we had funding of 5.9 readily available for this as of December 31st. Technically, we would have had 7.2 if we didn't have internally borrowing from it of the $1.3 million that we're showing you there. So we are fortunate that we have the enough water reserves and reserve funds to cover this water tower coming up. And that once the future fire truckers receive the temporary borrowing from the reserves will be replenished with an external loan because it'll be around the $934,000 around there. So the Trail Bridges project is currently, as I've mentioned, covered through the wastewater reserve funds in 2024 because we wanted to not have additional loans to pay. So we were waiting for the loan for the P&H Center amount of $160,000 so that we could use that towards our next loan, which would be the Trail Bridges. So as we noted, the threshold as for our policy is 500,000. Since this Trail Bridges is well exceeding that threshold, we want to explore the external borrowing options to start in September once the P&H Center loan has been paid in full so that these reserve funds for the wastewater are readily available for the wastewater treatment plant. Because as we know, that was going to be close to 45 to 60 million. And each year we're putting in little bits for the interim plant upgrades. So I can imagine for the next 5 years, we'll need at least $3 to $5 million to kind of help us along that way. The other loan that could be explored is our current landfill cell number 2 loan that has been internally borrowed from our water reserve funds. And this was done prior to our policy being implemented. There currently is about $508,000 left in that, and there's 12 years remaining. This would not be eligible for Infrastructure Ontario funding because infrastructure only does it for new projects and that year that you're trying to borrow for, but we could possibly go out and get another loan if this is one that you also would like to see borrowed externally. You may also remember that cell number 3 project is to commence in 2025. And we have put away monies of $50,000 a year. 25 was our first year and then 50,000 each year thereafter to cover any future landfill capital costs that the town itself would be responsible, which is 50% of the full landfill costs. So we'll have 175,000 available this year in the landfill reserves, but we require 259.5 in capital for the landfill. So the balance of 84.5 is to be internally financed over 2 years to cover the project. This is an example of a good way of using our internal services. Because you remember, we're already putting 50,000 a year away anyways for this. So it'll take us a year and a half to cover that from our existing. It's not asking for additional monies to cover this loan. It's already there. Kind of the same way we did for the loader. We put 40,000 a year. We have to buy a new loader. It's going to take us 3 years to pay that off. And then the amount of money that we continue to put there aside will be available in the 15 years when he needs to replace another loader. So this is kind of like Sudhay was telling you about. You put $40,000 for this road and you keep putting that money away. It's ready to go when you need to replace it. And then you may also remember, we also have an upcoming internal borrowing for the splash pad project, which is approximately 450,000. And we wanted to borrow that over 8 years. So you're looking at between 58 to 74,000, depending on the year. Interest is higher in the first couple of years and it goes down. We will always be paying off principal about 56,250. You may remember at the time when we were discussing the splash pad, the impact would be to the tax levy approximately 6.5% at that time. And that was to do with the maintenance and operations ongoing, as well as the capital expenses if you paid for it all at once. And a few council members felt that this impact could be less if we borrowed internally, which would reduce this impact. So that's happened on that one. And then financial implications, the wastewater reserve fund internal borrowing of that $1 million would be replenished with an external loan. So then our reserves fund for the wastewater plant would be available for what it was intended. There is a possibility that the annual repayments for this Trail Bridges may be slightly lower because when you do external loans, it's usually 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. We had originally set it up for an 8-year. So if we go for a 10-year, you're probably looking at about $34,000 savings from what we originally thought we were going to pay on that. And then I've also given you a look at the external borrowing projection with a 4% interest rate, assuming we have the fire hall, the trail bridges, the future fire truck, and the police station. So you're going to be looking at almost a $1.2 million in repayments. And they will range from 2035 to 2047. 20 years is the max that we would want to borrow on that. That's what our policy states. And you'll also notice that the police station loan is projected lower than originally forecasted at originally 650,000 a year, because the 8.5 million was put on there at 4.67%, but we've also received 700,000 from the police reserves to cover this project, and we also have in the budget in 2027 to spend 650,000, because that's what we figured the loan was going to be. Therefore, it will reduce at about 120,000. So down from 650 to about 530. And our debt, annual debt repayment for 2024 is equivalent to borrowing $53,200,000 at 5% over 20 years. And our annual payments would be 4.2 million, but nobody wants to be that high for loan repayments. So we are well within our limits. So the link to the strategic plan is open and responsible government. And the direction that we're looking for is that this report be received and that the finance committee provide direction to staff regarding possible external borrowing opportunities for existing internal loans. So really, I'm looking more, am I okay to proceed with the trail bridges to start in September? And do you want me to look at anything regarding the existing landfill cell number 2?
Thank you, Chris. Councillor Cable.
Thank you, Your Worship. Chris, I definitely think that it makes sense for us to look at an external loan for the trail bridges in order to free up some of those funds that we know will be needed for future water and wastewater projects. So I'd certainly be in favor of that. And then I wouldn't mind seeing a report come back to see what kind of loan options might be available for the cell number 2, and then we can see what that would look like. I'm wondering, do we also know the total amount that would currently be in our budget as far as revenue? I guess it would be reflected in our budget as revenue, but it's really ourselves paying for the interest, right? Because I think the way that we currently do it is that we borrowed it internally. We're then paying ourselves the interest off that. We're going to go and pay the bank or whatever external agency that would be.
You are correct. The only one would be water reserve funds for the landfill. It goes back to the water reserve fund interest. But the other interest that's borrowing from general reserves and reserves that we have there go back to the town as just basic revenue. And you'll see that in, I think it's tab number 5, where the council stuff is there, and it has the miscellaneous payments. I think it was like 12 to 15,000 was in there for interest that we're getting from that. So it's basically, if it's the fire department, they're paying the town back the interest to us instead of going to the bank. So we get to take that interest from that one department and put it back into general coffers, so that we're reusing that money. So that's the beauty of the internal, but you shouldn't be doing anything past 5 years for internal borrowing, because that really prolongs what you need for other areas.
Deputy Mayor Dickert.
Yeah, I support what Councillor Cable has said, that, go ahead with the external loan for the trail bridges and see what kind of rates we can get for cell number 2, and bring all that together for us to consider at another meeting.
So Councillor Cable, you said a report come back about cell number 2 and what that loan would look like. Do we normally do that? You just go out and get the best rate?
I still have to come back to council if I have to borrow, because there's always a bylaw for borrowing and whatnot that is required.
But you determine where the best place to go is, right?
Well, it's usually based on the rates. So I would come back to council and say, these are the rates that I had available. This is the only ones that would give us a rate of such and such. Or I would say it's probably better for us to leave it in ours because the rates are still too high.
Other comments, questions? Okay, so we did have a mover and seconder, Councillor Hawking, seconded by Councillor Fleet. So we're going to do the trail bridges with a external loan and cell number 2 with external. If it's worthwhile, if the rates are good. Anything else, Chris? That's it? Counselor Cable?
Thank you, Worship. Just one question about external borrowing. So you mentioned about the police station and how now we're anticipating that the annual repayment will be less than we originally projected. So I believe in this current budget, we've set aside 1.38% for police station. And I think next year we were going to do 2.38 and then it was another 2.38. So is the plan that for 2026, we would stick with the 2.38 and that in the final year, that's when you know kind of what the project cost is and that's when you pick what the percentage will be?
Yes, based on the information that was provided through your worship, sorry. Based on the information that was provided in there, this year it was 125.6. I think next year is 327, and then the following year is 649. We still want to keep that 649 because that's what we had budgeted for the next 3 years to have coming from taxes. So we knew that that was going to increase. And then if it goes down, because who knows if the 7.2 is the amount that we're going to borrow. We had it based on 8.5 million at 4.67. That's when we came up with the 650 because we had no idea what other funding was going to be available. That would have been the worst case scenario, 650.
Okay, I don't see any hands raised. All in favor? That is carried. Okay, item 9, items for discussion. Is there anything? Anyone's looking for more information on anything with finance? Not just any kind of discussion, but finance discussion. Nothing? Okay. All right, we do not have a closed meeting. I need a mover and seconder to adjourn at 7:07. Counselor Hudson and Counselor Hawking, all in favor? That's carried.